For the first few weeks of the semester, we've been focused mainly on the pattern of evolution. So we've talked a lot about what we mean by descent with modification, how we can demonstrate this pattern with the evidence that we find in the fossil record, and the relationships between organisms, homology and convergence, and things like that. And also, we've been talking a lot about patterns of speciation and diversification as represented on phylogenetic trees and how to understand those diagrams in terms of the evolutionary story that they tell. Now we're going to turn our attention to the process part of this, natural selection. What is the force that causes these patterns to appear? So let's talk process. So we mentioned before that both Darwin and Lamarck proposed mechanisms to explain why descent with modification happens, what causes it. And each of these are based on testable predictions or postulates about the way biological populations behave. So let's take a look at the postulates. At Darwin, we talk about 4 postulates that lead to the idea of evolution by natural selection. The first postulate is that there is variation among individuals. Okay, so if you look at a population of individuals of any species, no matter how much alike they may look on the surface, you see a big group of penguins, maybe they don't look very different, but there's going to be variability in nearly any kind of trait among that population. Second is that some of that variation is heritable. So it's going to be passed on from parent to offspring. When we talk about heritability, we're talking about the tendency of offspring to resemble their parents. So those variations can be passed along from generation to generation. Postulate 3 is that individuals vary in their success at surviving or reproducing. So we'll delve more into this postulate. It's a little bit difficult to get your mind around, but basically the idea is that in any generation there are more offspring produced than can possibly survive, and so some of them are going to leave surviving offspring, some individuals, and some individuals will not. So there's going to be variation between individuals and how reproductively successful they are. And the fourth postulate is that this difference in survival and or reproduction is non-random. Okay, it's going to have something to do with the particular traits that they possess, and so individuals with that trait are going to be more prevalent in the next generation. So Lamarck also had a couple of postulates under which his mechanism of striving and making changes to an organism's body in its structure during its lifetime. So use or disuse is going to cause changes over the lifetime. And then the second part of this is that those structural changes are going to be inherited by its offspring. So we call this inheritance of acquired characters. And so as an organism strives for something that it needs to do, it's going to change its body in some way, and those changes are going to be passed down to the next generation so that evolutionary change happens in that way from generation to generation. So now we've got some testable predictions, and along with basically logical arguments that the two made, Darwin and Lamarck. But if you can demonstrate that any of these postulates is not true in any given situation, then that mechanism is not going to be the force that is driving whatever changes you see, whatever pattern you detect. And so we'll talk a lot about Darwin's 4 postulates, but let's just think about the evidence now for Lamarck's 2 postulates. We do see some cases in which you can change your body. Organisms can change due to environmental factors during its lifetime, although the vast majority of traits can't be changed. Giraffes really can't stretch and increase the length of their neck just by reaching up for leaves. You can't make yourself taller by stretching out your back. These things are mostly not going to be environmentally determined. Postulate 2, for Lamarck, we can very easily do away with for the most part. It's been discredited time after time in heritability studies showing that you can cut the tails off a whole population of laboratory mice and let them breed, and the next generation is not going to have any shorter tails on average. The things that happen to you during your life, for the most part, are not inherited. So we find in the case of artificial selection, which remember was one of the key things that led Darwin to this idea of natural selection is that all of these four postulates have to be in place for artificial selection to work. There has to be some variability in the population, otherwise you have nothing to select. You've got no positive traits that you're looking for that you can choose which ones to breed. Those traits that you select have to be heritable. We'll talk a little bit more, we'll work on this in class a little bit more. Otherwise, you're not going to get a change in the next generation. And you as the breeder are deciding which individuals are going to be more successful or less successful, according to Postulate 3. And for Postulate 4, you are deciding that there are going to be particular heritable traits that are going to cause individuals to be more or less reproductively successful. So we see this in artificial selection all the time. And one of the consequences of artificial selection is that we tend to decrease genetic diversity in the course of very intensively selecting these traits. So if we look at this model of domestication and breeding for crops, we see that in the wild species, there's a very high genetic diversity due to broad interbreeding, sexual reproduction, the things that we'll talk about in the next section on mutations and genetic variability that you tend to see in wild populations. Over the course of selecting just a few of these variants for domestication to breed for the kinds of traits that we desire in these crops, we reduce that genetic variability by definition because we're only selecting a few genetic variants. And so in traditional crop breeding, we're able to target traits that we like fairly well. We increase the diversity a little bit. But when we look at modern methods for selective breeding, we've got very, very intensive selective breeding for particular traits, and we tend to reduce the genetic variability even more. So what this means is that our crop plants, because they have very, very low genetic variability, are not going to be very much able to adapt by natural selection to changing conditions in the world. So basically global change, climate change that we're seeing in modern times. So one of the things that researchers are very interested in right now is searching for wild relatives of crop plants and using genomic approaches to figure out what are the genes responsible for resistance to the kinds of things that we're going to start to see with global change, drought, increasing salinization or salt concentration in soils, differences in temperature, to try to breed that variability back into the domesticated plants without losing those desirable features. So being able to genetically engineer so that you keep the genes that code for the traits that we like in our edible plants, and also bring in that genetic variability for other features of the plants that are going to make them more adaptable in the face of changing climate to be able to continue to feed an ever-increasing human population. So we've talked a little bit about Postulate 1 and 2. We'll talk in more detail over the coming weeks about where that variation among individuals comes from and how you can increase or decrease variability in populations. We'll talk a lot more about heritability, how you can measure it, how you can determine to what extent variation is heritable and to what extent it's the result of the environment. But I want to talk a little bit more about Postulate 3. And how we come to know this. So Postulate 3, that individuals vary in their success at surviving or reproducing. So remember, it all comes down to reproductive success. The only reason survival matters at all is in that the longer you survive, the more you can reproduce. But reproducing is really the currency of natural selection. It's all about putting more of your own alleles into the next generation and making sure that those offspring are going to continue to put those alleles into succeeding generations. So let's think a little bit more about Postulate 3. So we can rephrase Postulate 3 as saying, not all offspring produced will survive. Some individuals will have more offspring and some will have fewer. Many, many, many will have no surviving offspring at all. And what I want to show you is that Postulate 3 is true in almost every biological situation you will ever see anywhere. This idea was based on the thinking of an 18th century economist, actually, by the name of Thomas Malthus, and his work was very influential in the thinking of both Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. They both read his work and realized that his thinking about how human populations increase and are limited by limited resources would apply even more so to natural populations of organisms. So Thomas Malthus is famous for this idea that human populations would be controlled by war, plague, famine, things that tend to cull the human population and make sure that the population doesn't grow out of proportion to the ability of natural resources to be able to sustain them, provide food, shelter, the other things that people need. So the quotation here, the power of population is so superior to the power of the earth to produce subsistence for man that premature death must in some shape or other visit the human race. So Thomas Malthus was not intending to influence the world of biological sciences. He was actually making an argument that we should not be too worried about helping the poor to survive, because those who are unable to attain the resources for themselves, somebody's going to have to die off anyway, and it might as well be the people who have not shown the ability to be able to secure those resources for themselves. So it was really kind of an early version of a social Darwinist argument that we'll discuss later in the semester, and a very sort of brutal naturalistic point of view kind of imposed on human civilization. And just the second quote here is just to show you that people are still worried about this even in the 20th century and to the present day, worried about human population growth. So this is from the Club of Rome think tank, 1972. If the present growth trends in world population, industrialization, pollution, food production, and resource depletion continue unchanged, the limits to growth on this planet will be reached sometime within the next 100 years. So this is an ongoing thought process that people are worried about this increase in population growth, and at what point are we actually going to reach the carrying capacity of the earth to support ever increasing human populations. And so Darwin and Wallace, their big breakthrough in thinking about natural selection was applying this kind of thinking to all organisms. To demonstrate why this is true, let's just look at a typical litter of breeding cats. So cats are able to breed after their first year of life, and they continue to be capable of producing litters for about 10 years or so. And so if we think about this cute little litter of cats, we can see that if this mother has a litter of 3 kittens in the first year, which is actually on the small side for a litter of cats, but we'll go with the conservative estimate, we can see in year 2, the mother is going to breed again. She's still reproductively active. She can have another litter of 3 kittens. And each of her kittens are now reproductively capable. And so this little kitten will produce another litter of 3 kittens. And that one in the second year will produce another litter of 3 kittens, and that one as well. In year 3, not only are all of the previous mothers still breeding, but all of their kittens are breeding. So for each one of these, we get another increase by 4 from each cat that's reproducing. We can see in just 3 years, we go from this little group of 4 cats to a total of 64 cats in just 3 years. And so for just one cat, if you think about her reproductive output over 10 years, it's exponential. It's going to get bigger and bigger every single year. And so we can see very easily, extrapolating this among all the cats in the world, that if all of these cats actually survived to adulthood and reproduced, we would be up to our armpits in kittens in very short order. So we know that in order for the population size to stay relatively stable, each pair of breeding cats, of all of these kittens they can potentially produce over their entire lifetime, no more than 2 of those can actually survive to reproduce if this population is going to be stable on average. So on average, each pair can do more than just replace themselves if the population is to remain stable. We can see this also rather dramatically if you remember the story of Charlotte's Web. And in the end, Charlotte, she lived 1 year, and she laid 514 eggs. Okay, so if every spider did this every year, replaced themselves and their mate with 514 eggs, the spider populations would be absolutely out of control. So only 2, on average, can survive to reproduce per mating pair. So what I want you to realize from this is the extreme improbability of you being alive right now to listen to this web lecture. You are the result of an entire evolutionary history of organisms that survived to reproduce against these kinds of overwhelming odds. So in the case of the spider, 2 in 514. Okay, so think of yourselves as mega, mega lottery winners just for being here right now and having survived all of these generations upon generations of intense selective pressure. Okay, most individuals that are born in the natural world do not survive to reproduce. Most of them do not. A very tiny, tiny, small fraction. And this is true of every kind of organism. Every organism reproduces more than what will just replace themselves. And if it's a sexually reproducing species, their sexual partner, they're always going to out-reproduce what can actually survive and have a stable population that can be supported by the environment. So there's always going to be many individuals that leave no surviving offspring. And so we can see that this happens due to incredibly strong selective pressure. If you think about every single time you wash your hands, you're killing about 99% of the microbes that live on your hands. The only ones that are going to be left are the very, very most fit to withstand that attack of soap and hot water. So now that we understand that very, very few are actually going to survive and reproduce in any given generation, we can ask what's going to determine which ones survive and reproduce and which ones don't, which are going to be these very lucky super lottery winners. And sometimes it's just luck, okay? It's not always going to be determined by the particular traits that the individual has. But to the extent that survival and or reproduction is non-random, to the extent that it depends on the heritable traits possessed by the individual, we can say that natural selection is happening. Okay, if the winners and losers selected by the environment, by nature, depends on heritable traits, this is when you're going to be able to pass on those beneficial traits to the next generation. There will be an evolutionary change toward having more of that trait in the next generation. And we can say that evolution by natural selection has happened. So postulate 4 is not necessarily always true. Things happen, but when it is, natural selection is the only possible outcome logically. So this is a logical argument. We can say that when all of these postulates are true, natural selection has to happen. It's the only possible thing that can happen. So let's take a look at this logical argument in a little bit more detail. So first, who picks the winners? Well, in artificial selection, the breeders pick the winners. We get to decide which ones are the lucky lottery winners that are going to pass on their traits to the next generation. In natural selection, it's the environment that does that selecting. It's going to select in a way that makes populations better fit to their particular environment. So, if an individual has a variation of a heritable trait that makes it more likely to be one of the very, very few to survive and reproduce, assuming a stable overall population size, that individual will produce more than its average of 2 offspring in a lifetime. If it does, that means a whole bunch of other individuals are not going to produce at all or going to produce fewer. If that trait is passed on to offspring, if it is heritable, there's going to be a greater proportion of the population with that trait in the next generation than there was in the previous generation. This is the pattern that's produced by this process, the change over time in heritable traits. This is how we've defined evolution up to this point, the change over time in heritable traits. It's the only possible outcome if all of these postulates are true. So now if we come back to the question of how we can demonstrate, how we can find evidence for the process that natural selection is in fact happening, all we have to do is show that all of these 4 postulates are true. We need to demonstrate variation among individuals. In a living population, how would you do that? You would go and measure the trait in the population and show that there's variation. Some of that variation is heritable. We'll talk more when we get to the section on heritability about how you measure heritability, but if you can demonstrate that there is a tendency for offspring to resemble their parents in that trait, then you know that that variation is heritable. Individuals vary in their success at surviving and reproducing. That's always true. That's not something you have to demonstrate. That is a fact of nature. Exponential population growth. And if you can demonstrate that survival and or reproduction is non-random, that individuals with certain traits have greater reproductive success over their lifetimes than individuals without that trait or with a different trait, you have demonstrated all 4 of these postulates. Natural selection is the only possible explanation for the production of the pattern if all of these postulates are true.